Linguistics Behind the Scenes.
What you always wanted to know about language and how to explore it.
With Christina Sanchez-Stockhammer.
And Dominic Piazza. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We're so happy to be back here with you and talking about linguistics and everything else that we find fascinating about the world of language.
Yeah, and there's so many things that one can talk about in the world of linguistics. So, Dominic, what have you been up to lately?
Well, I'm currently busy living in Europe, which I must say is quite an experience. You know, personally, I love history, and Europe is an old place, to say the least. I often get teased as the American, right? Our country is so young, and perhaps our perception of time and what constitutes as old is a bit different than maybe how other people around from other parts of the world might think of it. So I love being surrounded by so much history. And Christina, you know, you grew up here in Europe. What's it like for you being surrounded by all this history?
I suppose it's normal for me because I've been living here most of my life, and so I just go into different cities and I see old buildings, and it's normal for me. Actually, it's unusual for me if I go to a city and it's not very, very old, like when I go to the United States or to Australia, for example, because you don't go that far back in terms of the cities that you see, but obviously, of course, the cultural heritage goes much further back.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You see it in the cities and the architecture. I mean, in America, we do have old places, but probably not much older than maybe 200 or 300 years old. You know, if something's 100 years old, an American says, oh my gosh, it's so long ago. But a European, 100 years ago was just yesterday. And my European friends have been really surprised when I show them maps of American cities and everything is designed in grids, right? Because well, probably most of our cities are pretty young and they were probably planned to a large extent, whereas in Europe, everything just kind of develops sort of naturally and haphazardly with no specific plan.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I go to places as a tourist, I expect that I just need to find the cathedral or main church somewhere. And then I will be able to find my way around the most interesting part of the city center because all of the most exciting old buildings should be located there. And so there's a few cities where it's different. So you also have such a grid-like structure in the city center of Mannheim in Germany. But otherwise, most of the places that you go to in Europe have grown like that. And I really like going to different places and doing sightseeing and exploring new cities and their history and seeing all those old buildings that are very special and different from what I have in my own region. So yeah, I'm very fond of that.
Oh, I totally agree. Yeah, I realized here in Europe, it quickly became almost a personal trope for me that it feels like in most European towns and cities, usually the nicest building in the town is the church, right? There's one big church, one big central church oftentimes, and it's often very, very beautiful. It seems to be a common theme to me. But I think what's really cool about Europe is how kind of old meets new. You know, you'll see all of these cities where you'll have these historical areas that are really, really well preserved, but at the same time, you'll have something brand new right next to it. And so you'll just be surrounded by things that are extremely old, but also just kind of living your normal daily modern life and new things are still being developed. And I just think it's really beautiful. It's really beautiful the way that you synthesize together old and new.
Yeah, I really like that very much too. I have to say I care very much about old buildings, and I'm also a fan of preserving traditions. I mean, not all traditions necessarily. I mean, there's also some that are really good to go. But otherwise, I think it's very important to make sure that you can conserve those things that matter to the region where you come from and to preserve them for future generations.
Yeah, very, very well said, Christina. Very well said. I absolutely agree. Historical preservation is very, very important to me. And there's a lot of history to preserve in Europe and around the world. And of course, being in Germany, I'd say probably the biggest historical subject that people think about is World War II. And there's a lot of really important history to preserve here related to World War II and the Holocaust. And Christina, I think you've been involved in a project related to historical preservation in this way.
Yeah, that's right. Because as I just said, I mean, I really care about preservation of history in all its different facets. And also when it comes to World War II, I mean, everyone knows that the Germans played a really, really bad role there. And of course, I feel the responsibility as a person from Germany to ensure that future generations remember this and that they don't repeat the same mistakes that were committed in the past and the horrible things that happened during the Holocaust in particular. So with that project, I'm part of a larger project together with my team. Of course, there's always a team behind all the things that I do. So even when I say, okay, I did this, I mean, it usually means I did this as part of a team, a great team. And so what we want to do is conserve the testimonies, the memories of Holocaust survivors. And we use modern technologies to make them available to a general audience so that users can interact with those memories and try to find something meaningful and relevant in what those people have to say about the horrible things that happened to them in the past and which we mustn't forget.
Oh, yeah. And I totally love this because, yeah, we talked about history in Europe. There's also a lot of living history in terms of the people who are still alive today, who lived through some of these incredibly significant historical events. And especially when it comes to Holocaust survivors, I believe most of those who survive today are getting to be really quite old. And so I think it's so important that we preserve these memories because, you know, the thing about memories is, well, unless you write them down or preserve them in some way, well, when the person passes, they are lost. And so I think it's so cool that you're involved in this kind of high-tech project for historical preservation. And I believe your project centered around a Lithuanian Holocaust survivor named Abba Naor.
Yeah, that's right. So Abba Naor is a very, very special person. He's getting close to 100 years now, and he's fascinating. Very, very impressive. And I've had the pleasure of meeting him for real several times, which really was always wonderful. And the last time that I met him, he was driving around in a car with more than 90 years of age, you know, and we met and talked about the project and how we are trying to make his memories available to the whole world by translating them into English. And yeah, that was absolutely fascinating. And the great thing is that he goes to schools in different places in Germany and shares his memories with the children there, which is wonderful. But as you just said, I mean, he's getting close to 100 years now, and in the future it will be much more difficult for children to profit directly from Holocaust survivors that tell their stories in schools, that can share first-hand experiences them and tell them about all the atrocities that happened to them and show them that this is really something which must never, ever happen again.
Yeah, absolutely. And this particular figure, Abba Naor, is a really fascinating man. He's lived an incredibly interesting life. He's lived a very long life. He's had time to live a very interesting life. But of course, he was a Holocaust survivor, sent to a concentration camp, survived the death marches, and then after the war ended up living all around the world, moving to Israel, actually working for the Israeli government, for the Israeli Secret Service. The title of his autobiography is I Sang for the SS, My Path from the Ghetto to the Israeli Secret Service, which I think is a very striking title. He's also run restaurants and businesses, and he's lived part-time in Munich, actually, and he's done a lot of work in Munich. So he's a fascinating character.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important to conserve his memories for the future. And he has a lot to tell.
Well, yeah, I would certainly think so. Considering he's lived such a long and fascinating life, I would think that you could just interview him endlessly for hours and it would be so fascinating. But of course, it might not be so accessible to have such a long interview. And so I think what they did with this project was they captured all of his testimony, and then they used this technology to actually make it interactive and accessible.
Yeah, that's right. So Abba Naor was asked about 1,000 questions, and he was filmed with the latest digital equipment. So equipment which is also made to record 3D films.
Oh, wow.
So that was really very impressive. And so you can actually get a life-sized Abba Naor projection of the German version. And yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. And you can ask him all kinds of questions and follow-up questions in natural language, which is really, really cool. So you just phrase your question, you speak it into a device, into the microphone, and then you will see a video of him answering. And the great thing about this is that you still get the impression that he's really talking to you, because in between you have short bits of film in which he's waiting for someone to ask him a question. So it's very, very authentic and natural. And when I showed this to people, they asked me, oh, is he really sitting there waiting for me? And I was, no, this is really just a kind of video chatbot, but it seems so real. And so what will happen is that, he will reply to the questions, and it's wonderful because it means that you can basically ask him anything. The technology will actually match what the users ask with the videos when there is an answer for that.
Yeah, wow, this is a really incredible deployment of technology. I mean, I'm quite the history geek, so maybe that's why I'm so excited about it. But there's maybe like a little kind of small talk, kind of funny piece of small talk, a question you might ask someone, which is, if you could have dinner with any historical figure, who would it be? Which I think is a very, very difficult question. It would be very hard for me to answer that and pick a single person. It could be a person who's long gone, someone who lived long ago, or maybe someone who's still alive, doesn't matter. But I think it's a really fascinating question. And so kind of through this technology, you're preserving this person, you're preserving their memory, hopefully for generations to come, so that at any point in the future, you can sit down and have this conversation with Abba Naor about his life. So in a way, it's no longer a hypothetical. It's something that kind of today and in the future, you might actually be able to do.
Yeah, exactly. At least that's the idea behind the project, that it's possible to continue learning from Abba Naor's experience also in the future. And so this project, Learning with Digital Testimonies, the original is actually in German. So Abba Naor originally answered those 1,000 questions in German. And when I first heard about this project from my colleague Anja Ballis at LMU Munich, I was absolutely fascinated, and I said, wow, this is wonderful, but I think it would be great to share this with the whole world. And so why don't we make an English version of it? And that's the part where my team and myself, we came in. And so we translated a selection of the questions into English and then subtitled the videos in such a way that now people can also ask the questions in English and then get an answer in German, but with English subtitles so that they can understand it.
Oh, I love that. So yeah, definitely making it more accessible for a wider audience. And yeah, translation is an art form, right? Really an art form. It's a lot harder than people might expect. It's not always so direct. There's a lot of creative choice that has to go into it. I'm actually a really big fan of Japanese animation, anime, which involves a lot of translation, right? Whether you prefer the dub or the sub, usually I prefer subtitles. But there's debate within the community of people who they want the translations to be more direct because they think a direct translation is more authentic. But well, I think I might disagree with them. I understand the sentiment, but actually a direct translation doesn't always really capture the exact idea or essence of what you're trying to say. But I've never professionally translated anything. So Christina, can you tell me about the translation process, about what it's like to translate?
So what we did is, first of all, we had to get a transcript of what Abba Naor actually said in German, because we needed a text to work with for the translation. And then Julie Winter, who's a professional translator, Antonia Friebel, my PhD student, who's working on this project for her PhD thesis, and myself, we translated this, or rather Julie Winter provided a first translation into English, and then we discussed this. And we devised different principles that we wanted to follow regarding the translation. So we really wanted to make sure that the translation was as close as possible to the original. So we really tried to use the same metaphors if possible, the same sentence structure wherever possible, except, of course, if it was unidiomatic. So we really wanted it to sound like good English, and that's what we had that English native speaker for. Abba Naor is not a native speaker of German, so when he speaks in a way that might be different from standard English in some respects. For example, like when you are using a preposition in a way that is not commonly used in one particular variety of English. For example, as a British person, I would say at the weekend, and it might sound strange to have on the weekend, but that's correct in American English, isn't it, Dominic?
Yeah, that's right. To me, at the weekend almost sounds like sounds strange. Almost sounds like a mistake, but it's regional. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing. So sometimes there's variance, so it's possible to say things in one way or another, but it doesn't sound so idiomatic. And in some cases, it might also be that there's, for example, simply a preposition that you wouldn't otherwise use in German. And we wanted to make sure that the translation had correct English throughout, and that's particularly important because when Abba Naor speaks, he has his very own way of speaking German, which is absolutely lovely. So I think he's charming when he talks, and you can hear his voice, and he's transmitting all of those emotions. And so all of this comes together as something natural that characterizes him. But when you just have the letters one after another in the subtitles, and you have something that is not grammatically correct according to standard grammar, it just looks wrong, and it makes him appear in an unfavorable light. And this is something we definitely wanted to avoid.
Oh, yeah, certainly. I agree. That's one of the nuances of translating, that perhaps if you really, really wanted to capture the way Germans might hear it, then you could maybe replicate the non-standard speech in English. But as you said, it probably would not be favorable, right? And the reader might not even understand that that's what you're trying to capture. They might just think that it's just very poorly written subtitles or a very poorly done translation. So I absolutely see what you're saying. Did Abba Naor have any input about the translations?
Yes, so he did. In the beginning of the project, we actually made a translation of his reply to the question how he maintained the will to survive.
Oh wow.
Yeah, that's a tough one, definitely. And that's also one of the questions that I think are crucial here, one of the essential ones. And what he said is, Leben ist eine feine Sache. And we translated that as life is great. And so we produced some subtitling and showed that to him as a little mock-up together with a few other things. And he really liked what we did. So I was so relieved to see that he was happy with what we were doing, because of that, of course, that is crucial. And but then he said, yeah, but couldn't you also say life is a gift?
Oh.
And then we said, oh, that's even better. That's beautiful. Well, if you think life is a gift would be a good translation of that, if that is what you want to express, then of course, life is a gift shall be the official translation. So that is the one sentence where Abba Naor had to say, and we even made a little recording of him saying life is a gift. And that was so charming and made us also very, very happy.
Oh, that's very sweet. That's very sweet. And of course, not an exact translation of what he said, right? I suppose you could say life is a gift in German more directly, but he felt that translation captured the spirit of what he wanted to say. And so that's translation. That's translation. That's what really makes it an art form.
Exactly.
I was very surprised when I went to an opera here in Germany, and I thought, well, the opera will be in German. I won't understand what they're saying, but it's okay because there are other parts of an opera that you can admire aside from understanding the lyrics. But I was very surprised to find that at this opera house, there was a screen at the top of the stage that had English and German subtitles. Very surprised. So I was able to read the subtitles, and actually because English and German were side by side and I'm learning German, I actually found myself looking at the German a lot and comparing the German to the English. And I could see many instances when they took liberty with the translation, and I found it quite curious.
Yeah, I mean, in some cases you need to do that because otherwise it won't fit. That's one of the problems about subtitling, that you have to squeeze things into a particular time frame, basically. But yeah, and in operas, in addition, and also in our project, I mean, you might want to make sure that people really understand everything, and then you probably want to make sure that the vocabulary is not too difficult. So, I mean, particularly in older operas, you might get some vocabulary that is probably hard to understand, and you might have to use a very rare word. So this is also something that we tried to do in our translation project. We wanted to make sure that everyone in the world could understand Abba Naor's message as well as possible. And so we tried to make it as easy to understand as possible. So there was, for example, one case where he was talking about how he was treated by the SS, and he said that, well, they weren't exactly being treated with kid gloves. So that's a translation that Julie Winter first suggested. And I think that's a wonderful way of expressing this idea. But at the same time, we felt that this was really hard to understand. It's an expression that probably only advanced learners of English will understand. And so in the end, we went for something simpler.
Yeah. Wow. Yet another example. So this whole process is so important and so interesting. Our world is very international, but our world, it kind of runs on translation. And so hearing about all these different accommodations and things you need to make when handling the translation process is so interesting. And we didn't even get into dubs, right? Because I would think when you're translating for a dub, it's even more restrictive. You have to be even more creative and kind of abstract the translation, because you need to translate the dialogue in a manner that fits the timing of the words being spoken on screen. So that sounds like an even more difficult process to me.
Yeah, I would say so too. I think that's even more difficult, definitely. And of course, you need to make sure that people don't move their mouth and not say anything. But it's even worse when you hear something being said, but there's no mouth movement. But of course, in Germany, most films are dubbed, which is really very helpful for children in particular. But with Abba Naor's testimony, we didn't want to do that. So that was a very, very clear decision, because we just wanted to make it possible for audiences to also hear him speak in his very own characteristic, humorous way. I mean, you wouldn't believe that listening to the memories of a Holocaust survivor could also be entertaining and fun, and an experience that doesn't only make you sad, but it's just like it's so nice to listen to him, and we just wanted to share that with the world as well, and at the same time make it possible for everyone to understand the content, and that's why we selected subtitles.
Yeah, that was something that actually took a little bit of getting used to when I came here to Europe, because when it comes to like voiceover dubbed content, because coming from the US, while a very large share of international media is in English, so we can just watch it as it is. But when we do watch foreign films or foreign media, I would argue, in my personal experience, we almost always opt for subtitles instead of dubbing. Pretty much always, from what I've seen. So when I came to Europe and I saw lots of dubs and voiceovers on TV and in the movie theater, it seemed to me that Europeans are totally used to it because they grew up watching media with dubs and voiceover.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's the way that films are usually shown on TV, in the cinema. It's the most normal thing for me to actually watch dubbed films. What about you, Dominic? What do you feel like when you watch dubbed films?
Well, personally, not such a fan, at least when it comes to live action media. When watching live action media with a dub, I don't know. There's kind of like a strange disconnect or dissonance, because I know the voice doesn't belong to that person. And also I know that the words don't quite match the lips. So maybe I'm not such a fan.
Yeah, I can completely relate to that feeling. But on the other hand, it's quite convenient, particularly for younger audiences. But with the chatbot, it was really so important to us to make Abba Naor's memories available in a way that is as authentic as possible, that we, felt it was important to actually have subtitling rather than dubbing. And of course, it's also easier to make, and it's more accessible anyway. That's why, by the way, it's also possible to interact with the testimony in different ways. So what users can do is that on their mobile or on their computer, they can just talk into the microphone of their device, and then Abba Naor will answer. Or you can also type in the text. That's also possible. And there's a third thing that I really, really like about our English version that the German version doesn't have. And that is that you get a suggestion of 3 questions that you can simply tap on or click on, and then you will get an answer to that question. So that kind of disturbs the immersion a tiny little bit, but at the same time, we feel it's really helpful because not everyone might come up with many questions, and that way you can get ideas of what might be a good question to ask him.
Such a cool project. Such a cool project. I love the way this is mixing kind of linguistics and technology and history, all my favorite things. And your project that you're working on, I think you're not the only ones in the world who are doing this type of digital testimony work. The Shoah Foundation at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles is also working on preserving digital testimonies using some similar technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they have a large collection of digital testimonies. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they certainly have some famous backing, right? The Shoah Foundation was founded by Steven Spielberg, actually, a year after he made Schindler's List, which is a fantastic film. Have you seen it?
Yeah, I have. Actually, my whole school went to the cinema together, and it really left a mark on us, I would say. I mean, definitely on me.
I would say it left a mark on me too. The use of color in that film is incredible because, of course, the film was made in the 1990s, and yet almost all of it takes place in black and white, which is used for this very powerful, creative, artistic effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really admire that film. And so this going to the cinema, that was part of the Holocaust education that we have in German schools. So one of the things that you usually do is you also go to see a concentration camp. So in my case, that was Dachau. And going there and seeing those places where people were killed and the chimneys and, well, then seeing the names of people on those boards, people who have the same name or share a birthday with you or other things. I mean, that's really tough, and it makes you realize that we're actually talking about humans who have a lot in common with you and who were killed there on purpose, you know. Mm-hmm. I would say it was quite effective. I mean, it was with regard to me, but I think my whole class at the time, well, was really very, very impressed. What about you, Dominic? Is there something like Holocaust education in United States schools?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, you know, education in the United States is kind of highly variable depending on where you live because it's controlled a lot by the state governments and the local governments. But I grew up in California, where I think the education and the history education is very strong. And so, of course, we spend a lot of time from elementary school, middle school, and high school learning about the Holocaust and World War II. I also remember meeting a Holocaust survivor at one point because we do have some of them. We have some of them. And of course, I remember very distinctly reading The Diary of Anne Frank. We had to do that in middle school, and that really left an impression on me because, well, I think she was a young girl, right? She was only maybe 12 or 13 at the time. And of course, when I was reading the book in middle school, I was also just about that same age. And so it made it a lot easier for me to kind of put myself in her shoes and to imagine that I'm in her situation. And it really drove home just how unpleasant and horrible it really was. So this type of education, this type of history education is really important, I think. It makes an impact. Definitely.
Yeah, I entirely agree. Reading Anne Frank's diary also made a very big impression on me when I was a teenager. And I think it's mainly, because the diary tells her life story from her perspective, just like Abba Naor tells his story either personally in schools or through the chatbot, basically. And I think that's something that goes much more to my heart and possibly also to other people's hearts than if you just hear abstract figures. I mean, even if these are very, very large and you hear how many people were killed, still, I mean, knowing that there's this one individual person and hearing how exactly they suffered from the unjust situation at that time. These are things that really, convey very, very strongly that this mustn't happen again, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. When you capture these testimonies and you make them accessible, it really humanizes those who have been dehumanized. And like you said, it allows you to connect with them, to see that you probably have a lot in common with them after all, right? And I think that's really important today because, today people are maybe very quick to talk about what makes us different from each other, and our differences make us unique. Differences are not necessarily a bad thing, but I think we probably have so much more in common.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So Dominic, if you had the opportunity to ask a Holocaust survivor a question or several questions, what is it that you would actually like to ask them?
Oh, yeah. It would be hard. It would be hard to narrow it down. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, just asking them the basics about their experiences during the Holocaust. But I think maybe one that sticks out in particular to me is, these people have lived very long lives. They've seen the world change. The world has changed a lot in the last century or so, not least in terms of technology, but also in terms of politics and society. Almost everyone alive today are people who were not alive during World War II. We're kind of several generations past now. So I would love to ask them their perspective on how the world has changed, kind of what their outlook is, and how they remain optimistic.
Yeah, I think these are very beautiful questions. And I think you can actually also do that with the Abba Naor chatbot. Probably more so with the German one because it's got more questions, 1,000. But I think we also have a question on that in the English version. There we had to actually narrow it down to about 200 questions in order to make it feasible. And it was really difficult to select the questions because we wanted to select questions that we hoped would be relevant for the users. So to ensure that, we asked different people. We did a little survey, then came up with the about 200 questions we felt were particularly important.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. Well, I know you've said that as a German, you felt a very personal interest and connection to this project. But as a linguist, what really got you interested in it? And how did you kind of deploy your linguistic expertise here?
Yeah, that's a really good question because this is probably the least linguistic project I've worked on simply because it matters to me due to the content. But of course, it's also interesting from a linguistic perspective. So during the translation process, there were many interesting things that came up. For example, how particles are used. So particles are small words that we use in German just like that to emphasize things. But then I'm not sure if they always have a purpose. And then it's very hard to determine how to translate them into English. So in German, we might say something like, Du kannst doch nicht einfach gehen, which means you can't simply leave, but the doch there, it doesn't really have much meaning, but somehow it's something people would naturally add to make it sound German. And then the question was always how to translate these small words like doch, aber, etc. So you could say things like after all, etc. But I don't know, like how do you feel about those particles? Have you encountered them? I suppose they must be driving you crazy, Dominic.
Oh, goodness. Well, when it comes to particles, actually, the first thing I think of is Japanese because particles are an extremely important foundational part of Japanese and a fundamental part of every Japanese sentence, right? Essentially, they were explained to me that they're sort of like topic markers or things like that. They serve a very grammatical function. But yeah, particles in German can also be quite a bit tricky. Yeah, all of these little details that make German one of the trickier European languages, but not the trickiest, but yeah.
But it's good to hear that other languages have that too and also drive learners crazy. But yeah, we wanted to make sure that we don't unnecessarily translate those particles when they don't make an important contribution, because otherwise they would have made the sentences more complicated. So that was nice.
Yeah, and I would certainly think that another major difficulty, another major hurdle is that there are just so many different ways of phrasing things, of phrasing the same thing.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing about language, that very often we have different ways of expressing the same idea. And this is also crucial when it comes to the chatbot, because someone who wants to ask Abba Naor a question like, where are you from, might not necessarily use exactly the form in which the question was asked, and which is the form in which we enter that into the system, into the technology that matches the questions and the answers. And for that reason, it was very important for us to determine different ways of expressing the same idea in a question. So instead of where are you from, you might also ask, what's your hometown, or where were you born? We have to expect users from all over the world to express these ideas in slightly different ways. And that's why we try to find as many variants as possible. And our student assistant, Ahmad, was really crucial in that.
Yeah, and I think this is part of what really makes it feel so natural, because I think maybe, well, computers these days are becoming so extremely smart, especially with artificial intelligence, but maybe we've all been there in the past where if you don't ask the computer exactly what it's been prepared to answer in exactly the way it needs, then it might not understand you. And so, yeah, you're accounting for that. Essentially, you don't need to phrase things exactly as they were asked. You can phrase them differently, and you can still have a chat.
Exactly, yeah. So by setting the thresholds in a different way, you can allow for more variation, and that will allow more users to then actually come up with the correct answer for their question, hopefully. Of course, with 200 question answers pairs, the virtual Abba Naor chatbot will not be able to reply to all questions, but we hoped the most relevant ones. And everything that you will see there is authentic, recorded material. So none of it was generated. So while you might think, okay, wouldn't it be great to have artificial intelligence to provide even more answers by just using the material that we have and then make it generate answers that are likely to be Abba Naor's answers, we decided not to do that because it's so important to us to really conserve the testimony as it is, and to conserve Abba Naor's memories as they are and make those available to users in the future.
Oh yeah, well, and this idea of taking kind of this digital testimony and combining it with artificial intelligence tools, at least some of the modern large language models. This almost reminds me of like a digital afterlife. If you could feed all of this to an AI and then have it respond as the person. But actually this idea was done on an episode of Black Mirror, if you're familiar with it. It's a British science fiction show that often dips into dystopia most of the time. And so well over a decade ago, they had an episode about if you have a loved one who's passed away, you feed all of their social media into an AI, and then the AI allows you to talk with them from beyond the grave. Of course, it's just a computer imitating them. And that's kind of the problem with these AI tools, right? It's mostly an imitation. They have a tendency to hallucinate, maybe sometimes to fabricate things completely. So we want to make sure things stay authentic.
Yeah, so we're also academics, we're scholars. We want to conserve this, just like you quote from a book. You want to make sure, well, that it remains the same. And of course, we feel the responsibility to really handle this sensitive data with the utmost care, so as to make it available to future generations in the way that it was given to us, but with the technical means that make it explorable for others.
Yes, and when it comes to conversations with AI and computers in general, the old school test is called the Turing test, right? Which is very simple. Just basically, when you're talking to a computer, can you tell that you're talking to a computer and not a real person? And I think these modern AIs are really good at sounding like real people. But of course, with this project that you were involved with, you know that it's pre-recorded, that these are pre-recorded messages. So how do you make it feel natural? Can you have a natural conversation in this context?
Yeah, that's a good point. Of course, with only 200 questions, it will never be possible to have a conversation like with a real person or even with a chatbot that just generates language as you go along in the conversation. But I have to say that it's surprisingly authentic. So I can share my own experience with you. So at the inaugural event at which the interactive digital testimony was presented, I was in a kind of 3D cinema and we were wearing 3D glasses. And I had the opportunity to ask the virtual Abba Naor a question by using a microphone, a device. And then the virtual Abba Naor replied to me. And then when I walked out of that cinema, actually the real Abba Naor walked past me. And I looked him into the eyes and I noticed he didn't recognize me. And it felt like, why is he not recognizing me? We just had a conversation. And that was in spite of the fact that I was extremely aware that I had been talking to his chatbot, so to speak. So that really showed me that it works better than you might expect. And even the smaller version, the version that is not 3D, we're so used now to having video calls with people, either in a browser or on a mobile, that it feels very, very real. So I've had people next to me who actually asked me, "Oh, is that the real Abba Naor?" And I said, "No, it's really just a chatbot. You can ask him any question." And people actually also sometimes feel guilty asking him questions that might distress him because they don't want to be rude to the elderly gentleman that they see. And so it's quite impressive.
That's a very, very sweet story. And yes, certainly very inspiring. But this is so cool. So Christina, if people want to engage with this tool, this project, where is it available? How do they do that?
It's available online. We have a website for the project, which you can find in our links. And there you will find both the German testimony and the English testimony. And for the English one, well, you just click on it and it's there. It's free for you to use. And we're very happy for people to use it, to share it with others, and to ask Abba Naor the questions that they would like to know more about in order to learn from him about the things he experienced.
Very nice. I think I'll check that out. And of course, very fascinating discussion about some of these AI tools and how they're changing language and the way we speak. But I think that would probably be a good subject for another day. So Christina, thank you so much for sharing all of this with me. It was so wonderful to talk with you at this beautiful little convergence of linguistics and history and technology. This was just a totally fascinating discussion today, and I think we covered a lot. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you as well, Dominic. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I was so happy that I was able to share this topic that I really care about with you and also with our audience. So to everyone out there, stay curious, have fun with language.
And join us next time behind the scenes of English linguistics.